Hello and welcome. It's your host, John Davidson. Thank you for joining me. It's episode 29 of Career Coaching After Hours. I appreciate you joining me. This is going to be an interesting episode, and I've been excited to do this one this month because we've seen a lot of changes with the Department of Labor. And I usually don't take time out in this series to necessarily talk about any one particular government agency or any particular state. Certainly I talk about jobs and the economy and the jobs report, but there's been so much news this month and really over the last year or so about the Department of Labor specifically. I felt like it's time to dive in. And I did a post on LinkedIn where I pulled out some of these really kind of interesting, almost unsavory or lurid articles, but I think there's more behind all of that than just the sensationalism. So I appreciate you joining me for this episode. I'll try to keep it under 30 minutes as usual. And you'll notice in the posting links there here on YouTube, I've got all the links there if you want to check out the citations. And you'll see a couple of kind of interesting, almost Jerry Springer-ish type headlines there in The Guardian and the Boston Herald, to name a couple. So as usual, quick recap on this series. This series is ideally for kind of everybody here on YouTube to an extent. It's audience agnostic, so I assume I'm not your career coach, but I hope you find these videos useful or somewhat insightful. I use them as a little bit of a sounding board to talk about issues that pop up in client sessions or some of the things that I see in the news. So I appreciate you joining me, but absolutely consider talking to your own career coach, your own career counselor, your own financial planner, what have you, before taking my free advice. And as usual, check your sources. So like I say, I've got links there to some of these articles I think are very well worth reading. Some really interesting personal stories that I've picked out here. Folks who are still job seeking and struggling through this kind of no hire, no fire economy that we're in right now here in 2026. All right, onward through the fog. So what, in fact, is up with the Department of Labor? Because I sure don't know. This is a really interesting time in the department's history where usually we don't see a whole lot of headlines around the Department of Labor. If anything, we see maybe more headlines around the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the BLS, so one of the bureaus within the department. But when you have the secretary actually resign amid all of these allegations, and I hope folks don't think I'm being political or picking on anybody, but I've just never seen anything quite like this, where a cabinet level secretary leaves under some kind of inauspicious terms, and there was a forthcoming investigation coming through. But then even when she left, it was interesting, kind of some of the comments that she made about the deep state or kind of what's going on here. Some pretty challenging allegations, to be sure. So whether it's travel fraud or maybe some inappropriate relationships. My big concern with this isn't even necessarily this particular secretary or any kind of political issues. It's more like, well, this is a department arguably charged with an incredible task of protecting workers and making sure that, for example, OSHA has the people and the human capability and capacity and people power to keep our workplaces safe coast to coast. So this is not a Washington thing, this is not a California thing or a New York thing or a Florida thing. I mean, the Department of Labor is quite literally tasked with a whole host of issues. And it's the story of American workers. So I tend to be a fan of the Department of Labor, whoever's in office or whoever the secretary is. And so, like right there on your screen, you see that Department of Labor staffs the American job centers that can be found coast to coast. So wherever you are in the United States, you're probably not that incredibly far from a job center where you could talk to somebody, hopefully like me, who might help you file for unemployment benefits or look for a job or tune up your resume or talk to you about LinkedIn. And that's a resource I use on a pretty regular basis, even with my clients. So they have a resource that isn't just me. And I actually use one of their assessments on a pretty regular basis. So what does the Department of Labor do? Well, it affects almost everybody's paycheck, arguably, worker health and safety, blue collar, green collar, white collar, what have you, and overall job security. So kind of a big bailiwick. in my opinion. But don't take my word for it. You can take a look at their charter. But some of the issues I'm concerned about is what not only just the budget cuts or some of what's happening in terms of the restructuring, but this ongoing turbulence, even though a new secretary is on his way in. So, for example, wage theft, and I've had to deal with some of the fallout of this. In fact, I've been employed for an employer who was accused of wage theft, where there's a big investigation that thankfully I wasn't a part of. But one thing I talk to clients about is check your paycheck, and we could make a good argument. And this is a really interesting report if you want to take a look at it. This is a well-rated nonprofit called Good Jobs First. They did about a 20-page report, and in the last year, they claim, and there's data to back this up, wage and hour penalties have dropped 83%. Enforcement cases have declined by 97%. Workplace health and safety penalties are down 47%. So this report came out December 2025. This is even before the outgoing secretary resigned. Wow. So that blew my mind. I had actually not seen this report until I started digging a little bit deeper for this episode. But I think well worth reading and reviewing. I mean, how many of us know people who have a dangerous job, right? Where workplace safety becomes very critical. But the most dangerous thing that could happen to me is a paper cut. I don't have to go to work with steel-toed boots. I don't have to have personal protective equipment, PPE. But for the folks that do, and I've had to use those kind of things, this is really important. So I'm going to put a pitch in for taking a look at that data. But one of my big fears here too, and I don't mean to be an alarmist, is a $455 million savings when we pull money and we pull dollars out of the Department of Labor. What does that mean for OSHA? So that's a little bit scary. And so with those kind of level of cuts, I think most of us have probably seen evidence, OSHA type posters in the break room, or these kind of Department of Labor posters in a break room, where even whistleblowers, what happens when good people see an employer maybe do something not so good, whether it's disposing of chemicals or doing something inappropriate, putting workers' safety at risk. Do we have fewer OSHA employees to be providing this level of oversight for our places of work across the country? That worries me quite a bit, to think that American workers could be less safe because of these alleged cost savings. Is this a good place to cut? I'm also really worried about some of the changes, for example, in other parts of the federal government, for example, the Department of Education, where with all the cuts there, that some of those functions are now being pushed over to the Department of Labor. So now you have more bailiwick being nudged over into the DOL. Wow. At a time when we're already making these cuts. Youch. So like I nudge a lot of my clients, make sure you're safe on the job. Make sure you have your own protective equipment, even if your employer doesn't provide it, and I hope that they do. But maybe some of the bigger challenges is the Department of Labor staffing up job centers to deal with some of these really big these epic shifts within our career. And it's really hard to read the news and not see story after story about AI or the K-shaped economy or all the layoffs that we're seeing, or even buyouts like the recent Microsoft buyouts that we saw right here in the Pacific Northwest. So 1.2 million laid off tech workers. What does that mean for our economy? Do we have an infrastructure to deal with this, to help folks deal with some of the fallout? Should we be maybe using some of those cost savings to provide for extended unemployment benefits as folks fight and struggle to find a new role? Should folks like me be pulled into the American job centers to work with folks, maybe one-on-one perhaps? It's not uncommon I get hired, for example, after somebody has gone to their local work source or job center and maybe felt like they could have received some better support. And I don't mean to cast aspersions on any of these job centers, but what if we had more people power to support all these individuals who've been laid off? And this article in Slate, I think, is well worth reading. Kind of a poignant story there that may sound familiar. You might know some folks who are going through something quite like that. But as we dig into the data, one of the other things that really scares me about the Department of Labor and any shakeups or changes is Bureau of Labor Statistics data, the BLS data, the jobs report, or what we can proactively see or appreciate in terms of the veracity of some of the data that comes out of the BLS and out of the DOL. Because I think a lot of folks like me, not just career coaches, economists, may feel like, well, they've got to go elsewhere to figure out what in the world is going on. So, for example, here's Fortune pinging thousands of CEOs, trying to figure out what in the world is really happening out there. And I've been saying this for a while now. In the absence of clear data from BLS, or maybe data that's consistent in how it's reported, for example, we had a gap this year in terms of data. And I've written about what happened in February. We lost about 90,000 jobs, and then suddenly they're found here in March. Are we going to have to look at polling, maybe Gallup or maybe Fortune or other sources of data just to figure out what's actually going on right now? And this has been a bit of a challenge for Wall Street as well, and hiring managers and companies trying to deal with everything from tariffs to the price of oil, price of gasoline. But what happens when we don't have accurate data related to how long people have been on unemployment, or how many people are applying to jobs and being successful? But interesting to note, it's so many stories about AI job loss, and maybe they're overblown, at least for now. But without data, how would we know that? And so here's an article in TechCrunch that I think is actually really well worth reading through. Great point to distill it down. Even if you're not changing jobs, even if you're still a teacher, a doctor, a lawyer, a pipe fitter, what have you, your job is changing on you. That we are going through this absolute inflection point of AI as a skill set, as a competency, and AI literacy affecting virtually every role in the United States. Is the Department of Labor doing what it can to help us manage this? I don't know. But this is an article, Business Insider, another one well worth reading here as I wrap this up as we get a little closer. But to take a look at some of this data, so you'll notice there's some data points here from the Bureau of Labor Statistics about hire rates. And so a lot of times we talk about the jobs report, where we can see, are we up, are we down? Do we have missing jobs? Do we have tens of thousands of new jobs that may just seem to magically appear, like in the March report? We always get them a month after, so we get the March report here in April. But this is a really interesting concept, and maybe slightly terrifying, this idea of a job seeker recession. And if you see this quote here, this is a showstopper. I mean, this combination of slow hiring and low unemployment, both, this perfect storm, is unprecedented in more than 25 years of government data. So assuming we can believe this data that's current in the last year or two, and of course the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics was summarily dismissed. I did an article about that not too incredibly long ago. So again, more of this upheaval, not just at the Department of Labor, but the BLS. Can we rely upon this data? Can business owners, boards, corporations, can they rely on that data to make good decisions in terms of hiring at all different brackets? So there we be. But those numbers are a little bit scary, to say the least. So part of the challenge is we have data like this. What do we do about it? Should we have the Department of Labor leading the charge or helping with this issue? But then, is the data itself accurate? We don't know. And I use this data, and this is where I nudge a lot of folks to, yes, certainly keep in touch with your local data. So wherever you are in the United States, your state should be tracking data related to employment. But I tend to take a longer and wider view. I have clients in typically every single time zone at any given time. So although state data is really interesting, without good solid federal data, how can some of our big multinationals make decisions? So, for example, Starbucks, based here in Seattle, now creating a second headquarters in Tennessee, in Nashville. Well, that's interesting. Why would they choose to do that now? How does that affect the bigger economic picture? What does that mean for retail? What does that mean for the PNW? We see why we like accurate data. So what can you do? So I'm going to, here are a few bullet points that I lined out, and I think these are generally pretty darn applicable, whether you're blue collar, white collar, green collar, whatever collar you might be, but stay informed. Stay informed. So I'm constantly nudging clients. You read on a regular basis. So let's say you're in a job interview. It's not a completely oddball question. How do you stay informed in this age? Whether you use AI, whether you choose not to use AI, whether maybe you use Google News, but to try to stay informed. So if you notice, I provide a range of different citations there. To just have stay present as well. Present in what is your employer doing? What can you do to be invaluable within your current organization? And what about AI literacy? Whether or not you want to use AI may not be as much of a choice as we think it is. Another topic that comes up sometimes in my discussion is the idea of a union. And so here in the Seattle area, for example, we have unions related to Starbucks or REI, for example, not just Boeing. Some are large, different size employers. But then one thought is the freelancers union, for example. I'm a member. Would it make sense to join a union? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. But what would that look like? Or maybe talk to your coworkers. How do things feel? What can you do to support each other? Gets into one of my last points there, keeping LinkedIn up to date. Please, keeping tight with your professional network. Never stop networking. If you treat your career somewhat like an actor, you realize that every role, every stage opportunity, every film, every television commercial ends eventually. So, thought process there. And by the way, it's free to be a member of the Freelancers Union. So if you happen to be starting a side hustle, for example, second point from the bottom, maybe it makes more sense to have that collective. I think their email newsletter is really interesting, but I'm also a freelancer. I'm a solo practitioner, so I might be a little bit biased. But to think of our career maybe as more fluid, perhaps. Another key item here too, document everything. So I almost hate to say that, but in this current climate, whether you work in a factory, whether you're blue collar, white collar, you work in a law firm, medical context, teaching context, education, tech, whatever your field or industry may be, now might be more important than ever to document. Saving emails, saving performance improvement plans, being clear with your supervisor and your manager on your expectations. If we have less oversight from the Department of Labor in terms of worker safety or just general whistleblower protections, then maybe it's now more incumbent upon workers than ever to take that kind of, not so much into their own hands, but to be educated, be ready if something were to happen. And you suddenly found yourself in a situation where you might need to keep some of that data or maybe file a lawsuit kind of thing. Unfortunately, I've had to give the Washington State Employment Lawyers Association contact info out more times than I perhaps care to over the years. Another point here too is to take extra safety precautions. So again, whether you're blue collar or white collar, I've had jobs where steel toe boots are a good idea and eye protection is mandatory. So it kind of pains me to say that, but maybe workers should double and triple check their own safety requirements. Is your employer compliant? Would your employer not report or not provide PPE, possibly knowing that, or maybe gambling that there are fewer OSHA employees to actually conduct audits or site visits? I hope not. But of course, stay safe, folks. Make sure that you're doing what you need to do to protect yourself. But in addition to a side hustle, it's this idea of maybe continuing education and a growth mindset. Maybe in the face of this kind of wacky economy that we're in and this tidal wave, this inflection point of AI, maybe it's more important than ever to consider continuing education. What can you do to sharpen current skills, but then also maybe build new skills? So for example, even if you're not in love with AI, does it make sense to do some training courses with Claude or ChatGPT or Gemini, what have you, to sharpen the sword a bit? So a few practical pointers. I'm sure I've mentioned several of these in other episodes, so I appreciate you indulging me. All right, and also thank you for joining me for this episode. Like I say, I felt it was almost necessary at this point. I felt like there's so much in the news about the Department of Labor, and not a bad idea to reframe the discussion in terms of how important it is that we have such a cabinet level department. So kudos to the hard workers at the Department of Labor. Your work is appreciated. So hoping funding is restored to the DOL, and hopefully some of this turmoil settles down. But anyway, if you think I'm on target or off base, let me know one way or the other. I appreciate you joining me for yet another episode, and I've got lots of ideas for episode 30 coming up. If you have some ideas, absolutely reach out. Feel free to email me, message me through comments here on YouTube or through LinkedIn. Musical credits, as usual, wonderful musicians. I appreciate the background mix. Check them out online, buy their albums, support all of them. They're amazing. And they make my nasally voice tolerable. So again, thanks for joining me. I'm so excited I made it to episode 29. And here's to a great April as we move into May 2026. All right. Take care of yourself. Bye for now.